My entitled neighbor attempted to break into my house and steal my grandmother's family heirlooms, so I had him imprisoned and his kids taken away. When my grandmother passed away, her house was inherited by my father, who tragically passed just 3 days later after being hit by a drunk driver. The house then passed to me. On my first day moving in, my neighbor Todd showed up with his 2 kids. The moment I opened the door, he started demanding to know why they hadn't been invited to my grandmother's funeral. Before I could respond, he demanded a copy of her will, claiming that his kids were like family to her and should be allowed to take whatever heirlooms they wanted. Without warning, his kids ran past him into the house and began rifling through drawers. His daughter found a ring that had been passed down for 3 generations and was meant for my aunt, and she immediately put it on. I told Todd to get his daughter to take the ring off, but he refused, insisting again that his kids were like family to my grandmother. I shouted back that Grandma actually hated them for being entitled and ruining her lawn with dog poop. I threatened to call the police if his daughter didn't remove the ring, and that finally made him listen. His daughter threw a tantrum and even hit Todd, but she eventually took the ring off. As they left, Todd yelled that this wasn't over and that he'd get his heirlooms in the end. He wasn't bluffing. Over the next few days, he started showing up uninvited, finding every excuse to talk about the will, his kids, and what he believed my grandmother would have wanted. He acted as though his kids were the rightful heirs and frequently tried to guilt-trip me by saying how much they loved her and how devastated they were not to have a piece of her memory. It was all nonsense. One evening, after a long and exhausting day of sorting through my father's belongings, I came home to find Todd standing on my porch with a box of donuts. He had a grin on his face that made my skin crawl. Before I could even ask what he was doing, he launched into some sob story about how his daughter had cried herself to sleep, heartbroken over not getting any of my grandmother's belongings. He offered me a donut and suggested we talk neighbor to neighbor. I flatly told him that neither he nor his kids were getting anything. We'd already been through this. I walked past him, leaving him and his donuts on the porch, dumbfounded. He didn't say anything as I closed the door, but I could feel his eyes on me through the window for far too long before he finally walked away. Things quieted down for a few days, and I started to think maybe Todd had gotten the message. But about a week later, I came home from running errands and found Todd and his kids at my front door. His son was trying to pick the lock with a screwdriver while Todd stood behind him, coaching as if this were some kind of life lesson. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing before I completely lost it. I shouted at them as I ran up to the door. Todd turned around, startled for just a second, before putting on his infuriating fake smile. He tried to calm me down, claiming it wasn't what it looked like and that he was just trying to help with my stuck door. I told him. It was stuck because it was locked to keep people like him out. His son dropped the screwdriver and his daughter hid behind him, but Todd kept up the act, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. He even had the nerve to suggest I didn't need to call the cops, but I wasn't falling for it for a second. I kicked Todd and his little troublemakers off my property and warned them that if they ever tried pulling that stunt again, I'd call the cops. He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't about to let him speak. I pulled out my phone and hovered my finger over the call button, which seemed to do the trick. Todd threw his hands up in mock surrender and left just as quickly as they had come. I stood there for a long time after, heart still racing. I knew I should have called the police right then, but something held me back, probably exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I let it go. A few days later, I realized something was wrong. I had been slowly packing up boxes in the garage, putting away sentimental things I wasn't ready to sort through yet. One afternoon, I went to grab a few boxes, only to discover that several were missing my grandmother's old photos, letters, and some of the jewelry she had given me. All of it was gone. I knew it was Todd. Who else would have the audacity to break into my garage and steal from me? But without proof, I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just storm over to his house and demand my things back. So, I did the only thing I could. I filed a police report. The cops came, took down my statement, and told me there wasn't much they could do without proof. It felt like a slap in the face. I was beyond furious but helpless. The next day, I confronted Todd while he was watering his lawn, demanding to know if he had taken my stuff, He just smiled that same smug smile and denied everything. I told him I knew it was him because he was the only one who knew about the valuables in the house. Why would a burglar break into the garage and leave the rest of the house untouched? His smile, paired with his denial, infuriated me. I realized I wasn't going to get far this way, so I offered to pay him just to get my grandmother's photos back. I told him he could keep anything else of value, but I needed those photos. They were the last ones I had of her. For a moment, his eyes seemed remorseful, but he still denied it, saying he was sorry for my loss, but wasn't the one who stole the boxes. He even blamed one of my friends who helped me move in. My blood boiled, and I knew if I stayed there any longer, things would escalate. Todd wasn't going to admit anything, and without proof, I couldn't do much. So, I did the next best thing. I installed cameras. It took a few days to set everything up, but once they were in place, I felt a bit of relief. If Todd or his kids tried anything again, I'd have proof. One evening, I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there stood Todd's kids. His son was wide-eyed and hopeful, while his daughter stood behind him looking bored. The boy, bouncing on his toes, said their dad wanted me to come over for dinner that night. I stared at him. The last thing I wanted was to sit down for a meal with the man who had been trying to steal from me for weeks. I told the boy I was busy, but before I could close the door, he yelled, "But we're family." He was really laying it on thick, practically bouncing with excitement, as if this were some grand invitation. He even said, "Grandma would want us to eat together." Hearing him use the word family made my heart tighten. My grandmother had never considered these kids family. Still, Jason wouldn't let it go. He grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her forward, begging me to come. Sarah rolled her eyes, clearly uninterested in playing along, muttering, "Yeah, whatever," without even bothering to make eye contact. I had an overwhelming feeling that Todd was up to something again. The idea of sitting down at the table with him made me want to slam the door in their faces, but the kids were just following their father's instructions. I couldn't really blame them. Jason leaned in closer and batted his eyes. "Please. It'll make Dad so happy," he pleaded. I should have said no. I really wanted to, but for some reason, the words didn't come out. I reluctantly agreed, saying I'd stay just for dinner but wouldn't stay long. Jason cheered, grabbed Sarah's hand, and they rushed back to their house. When I arrived, the smell of something roasting in the oven filled the house. Todd greeted me as if nothing had ever happened, flashing that same overly cheerful smile. I didn't trust it, but I sat down at the table anyway. Sarah slouched in her chair, barely paying attention, while Jason eagerly ran around, helping set the table like it was his most important task in life. Todd excused himself to the kitchen to finish the last meal. As I was about to start eating, I noticed Sarah glancing nervously between me and her plate. She quickly swapped her plate with mine, thinking I didn't notice. I asked her what she was doing, but she shrugged and mumbled, "It's nothing." Before I could say more, Todd called from the kitchen, asking if we were ready to eat. Jason was already halfway through his food, and Sarah just stared at the plate she had switched. Then, as Todd walked back into the room, Sarah's plate suddenly slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, scattering food everywhere. Todd rushed over, frowning, while Sarah offered to get another plate from the kitchen. I was done playing along. The night before, Todd and his kids had climbed over my fence, broken into my shed, and rummaged through my belongings. They had even tried to start a bonfire with old photo albums. I had proof this time. I called the police again and showed them the footage from my security cameras. Finally, they took me seriously. Todd tried to pass it off as another misunderstanding, claiming his kids were cleaning up after teenagers had trashed the yard, but the police weren't buying it. They warned him to stay off my property or face legal consequences. I thought that would be the end of it. Todd had been caught red-handed, and the police had stepped in. But a few days later I came home to find a for sale sign in my front yard. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Then, I saw Todd standing there, talking to a couple as if he were showing them the house. Furious, I marched up to him and demanded to know what he was doing. He grinned, unashamed, and said he was just helping me out. He claimed I could use new owners since I seemed overwhelmed by the house, and all the paperwork a weak excuse he had twisted from something I mentioned in passing. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I yanked the sign out of the ground and called the police once again. This time, they issued Todd a formal warning: stay off my property or face serious charges. But of course, Todd didn't listen. A few days later, I woke up to find my car vandalized, the tires slashed, and the windows smashed. It was a nightmare. I didn't even need to check the cameras to know who was responsible. The police came, took my report, and reviewed the security footage. Sure enough, Todd and his kids had been caught sneaking onto my property in the dead of night to vandalize my car. This time, Todd was arrested. As they hauled him away, he yelled about how the house should have been his, and how I had no right to keep it all for myself. With Todd behind bars, his kids were left without a guardian. Their mother had been out of the picture for years, so they were placed in foster care. I felt bad for the kids and even considered taking them in myself. It wasn't their fault. Their dad had raised them wrong, and now their lives would be even harder in the system. But the neighborhood was quiet for the first time in what felt like forever, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I watched them drive Todd away. The nightmare was finally over.